But it's also a contrast, and especially in the European context, to party rule, rule by commissions, democratic deficit, and so forth. But this vision, where the people decide what political matters actually are, is utopian except in this moment of rule by acclamation, where you've got this kind of mass movement. Okay, so now this turns into a discussion of the political. What is the political? So for Schmitt, it's a matter of decision. It's a matter of boundaries set by politics itself. So the critique of this is that there is a thing called the political that we can ontologize and distinguish and contrast to the political of representative normal liberal democracy. That's a kind of diminished political. The real political is a much bigger thing. And so Lefort is, it means any area of society where issues of law, power, and economics are contested. That's the political. So what we get is a kind of correlative notion of the political and democracy. Real democracy matches up to the real political. So the political becomes something antagonistic to actual procedural politics, and there's an ambiguity in Schmitt's formulation as well. So it's not really that actual procedural politics is the definer of the political. It could be that any kind of antagonism that threatens to become political or violent is political. So then we had a new idea that of the post-political. So the post-political is the actual politics of liberal democracy, which has had the political taken out of it. So it's the evacuated political. So this is actually, I think, a pretty good description of, this is mostly in the context of science and technology policy. But the idea is that experts have taken all of the content out of politics so that all we've got left is something that's post-political and therefore evacuated. Okay, so the model here again is not procedures, but acclamation as the real political. So it's only at this moment of acclamation or collective effervescence, or whatever you want to call it, that we have the full grasp of the political. We begin to see this in the Occupy Wall Street movement itself. So you've got this wholesale rejection of electoral politics in favor of groups operating on the basis of consensus. That's the acclamation model. And as an alternative to present politics, which Graeber calls organized bribery or mafia capitalism. Well, that's a characterization of the welfare state. Okay, so this is, in a sentence, the contrast that is behind this. We've got the welfare state, we've got liberal democracy. It's a system we want to replace. We can't replace it within the system. The only alternative is some moment in which we can act as a group on the basis of consensus. Okay, so is this what political good does this actually do? Acclamation is a kind of vanishing point in discussion where the general will is realized, and most importantly, it transforms those present in this event, to use this technical language of Perdue, that's free of history and social constraint. We throw out all of that stuff in this moment of group acclamation. So it's transformative, and it seems, if there's going to be a transformation, it seems that it's both necessary and attractive. However, it's also risky. So here's Zizek on Occupy. And he closes with a quote from Lacan to the revolutionary students of 1968. He says, "As revolutionaries, you are hysterics who demand a new master. You will get one." Well, they didn't get one, but the risk there is still the same. Acclamation yeah, it could come out as transformative in a way that would make us all able to function with one another in a kind of withered away state in Marxist utopia, but it might not. Okay, so it's strange, but not, given the logic of this, that surprising that a certain form of democratic political critique would end up with this idea of transformative acclamation. But it makes perfect sense, because if you want a radical alternative to the present system that you can actually achieve, you can't do it within the present system other than by setting it aside and basing it on a new kind of democratic model. However, one of the risks here that I think is a more telling response to this is that the appeal to acclamation is really a desire to escape from the political itself. And what it's, in a sense, wants to escape is from the dilemmas of politics. So no freedom for the enemies of freedom is, yeah, it's a problem of liberalism, it's a dilemma, it's a paradox, and so on and so forth. But it may be that that really is what politics is full of and about, that there are conflicts that cannot really be resolved by going one direction or another. They're antinomies. And so, Weber's view of on the ethics of intention, the ethics of responsibility is one of those. If you're purely one ethics of intention guy, you're going to fail. If you're purely an ethics of responsibility guy, then you have no purpose. So you can't be those ideal types. You have to be some kind of compromise in between. And Oakeshott's famous for talking about the state as vacillating between a kind of association with a goal and a neutral association without a goal. Okay, but this is right there in Derrida as well. So he calls this autoimmunity. And in his case, he's talking about freedom and equality. But the idea is democratic freedom only makes sense if everyone's free. But the equality becomes itself incalculable. And I think a way of thinking about this is we can all be for equality, and we can define equality in a particular way, but pretty soon, if we ask for more and more kinds of equality, we end up with conflicts between kinds of equality. So it could be that we want equality in terms of physique. We should all have the same beautiful bodies. And we also would want equality, we might say we want equality in terms of time on a treadmill. But knowing the various bodies around, if people had equal time on the treadmill, they would have unequal bodies. And so that wouldn't work. So the two concepts of equality eventually, and this is, I think, true generally for extended notions of equality, tend to conflict with each other. Okay, so if all this is true, if politics is full of these insoluble antinomies, then the illusion of democratic theory is it's going to permanently overcome things that are actually intrinsic parts of politics itself. And you can only really overcome that by getting rid of politics. So the acclamation model is sort of the easy way out. It's really a denial of politics. And but after you had the acclamation and you got the new system, you're going to generate new antinomies or antinomies of equally problematic kind. Okay, so that's my critique or my sort of survey of where we are in contemporary democratic theory. Not a really good place. If you are looking for a magic solution here, you can line up with Badiou. He's got a great reading of Lenin, which says basically that this is what we need to strive for, the kind of transformational moment that will allow us to get rid of the state and therefore politics completely. That's really the place that democratic theory more or less drives us to. Okay, thanks. Into what?
Into liberal. Why don't you
Yeah, it does. Well, no, I think, you have the antinomies whether you have a liberal state or not. So you've got insoluble problems in politics regardless of what state you're in. And it's just that liberalism has its own family of them because it's got these explicit ideals like freedom and equality that can't really be mutually realized without something giving and some kind of exception made, just like the no freedom for enemies of freedom exception. So you're never going to have the absolutes of these things. You can absolutely, exactly. So that's why you need these parties that are both interest parties and ideal parties in order to have that conversation, but you have to have a motivated conversation.
Yeah, I'm wondering about this, something that goes back at least to Jefferson and been made more universal, the idea of democracy as a social idea. Central to it is that effort to balance, which is, you never actually do, liberty and equality, especially liberty as property rights, but extending beyond that. And I'm thinking of Durkheim, the division of labor, the idea of the dignity of the individual, which opens up to a series of things with rights, and the idea of the forced division of labor. Then discussions by T.H. Green and Henry Sidgwick. I think these theories provide some anchorage for the welfare state. Other than the instrumental dimension, what I'm thinking about is that brought up Dewey's very idea of democracy is always imperfect, and it's a working idea that's going to have antinomies. And the idea of a civil society, interested groups, I guess that goes back to Madison, but Dewey's take on it is a little bit different. Anyway,
Well, I think that
Go where you want.
Dewey is one of those odd figures where he's himself a bundle of contradictions, and Brent's paper yesterday was very good in exposing a lot of those contradictions, but I don't think he embraces the idea of contradiction. He doesn't want it to be that they're insoluble problems or whatever. He thinks that no, the solution is more democracy, but he's just going to say we don't know what that is. Well, that's not, that's a bit of a cheat.
But
you can sort of see.
Isn't it? In terms of always historically contingent, always blended with local traditions, but there is a sense of justice that's very, very important as an element of conflict and discussion, even if there is a consensus on it.
Yeah, see, I think that Dewey's not so much a justice guy as a transformation guy. So he's much more concerned in transforming people in their way of life.
He has an idea of justice in terms of, it's very similar to Durkheim's equality in the conditions of conflict. Dewey is a kind of equality in terms of the means of participation in society. And as an ideal, not as a standard that ever, same to Durkheim, can ever be met.
Yeah, but I think also what comes with that is he's concerned about the ignorance of people, and that he's much more of a transformation guy like these guys are, but he wants it as a continuous process of transformation. So rather than it happening in this magic moment of acclamation, it's going to be something that's an ongoing project of transforming
and that's a
people.
Jeffersonian, goes back to Jefferson.
Could be, yeah.
The concept of democracy is a very contested term. And I recently read a book by two scholars from Canada, and they call it an open process. They argue that there are two forms of democracy. One is official democracy or democracy from above. I think all of these intellectuals are talking about democracy from above and democracy from below. These scholars mention what happened in the French Revolution, the French Revolution, how people were popularly tried to capital state power and abolish private property in order to establish an egalitarian democracy. So your discussion is focusing on official or elite democracy without looking at democracy from law. I would like your own interpretation of democracy, where you stand on these issues.
Yeah. Well, that's, yeah. I guess, you know, I certainly respect these revolutionary moments. So, you know, the French Revolution, despite its obvious problematic outcome, was a general, you know, an expression of, it was one of these moments of acclamation. So it's not just they're not making something up here. This stuff really happens. It is transformative, but eventually you get back to a kind of normality because decisions have to be made, you have to have structure, you have to have a form. Bethune is actually quite good about this because he says, you know, the problem with democracy is it's a form of state. And the problem isn't the democracy part, it's the form part. And the form part always gets in the way and conflicts with the democracy part. So to have real democracy, you can't have a state. And that's why he wants to go to this sort of post-Leninist withering away, but that's going to require transformation of people so that they are able to live under these new conditions. Yeah, so the two things go together. So, you know, what is my view on this? You know, I must say I'm a bit skeptical about, I'm a bit like Lacan, that I suspect that you'll end up with a new master rather than the withering away of the state. But that's just my cynical view. John?
Yeah, slightly puzzled by a couple of things which I think are generally sort of very sympathetic to what you argue. But one issue is that you made no mention of special interests. So in a lot of the discussion of democracy, the problem isn't the relationship between the people, if you like, as an electorate and the state, but the nature of decision-making that takes place outside the state, which has consequences for people.
Okay, but that's Dahl's notion of polyarchy.
Yeah.
That in a nutshell. Yeah.
But I mean, that's where that's in the sense where the issue of the welfare state comes in. But I would say one of the issues of democratic politics is the need to govern as if in the public interest. That is, that there may be different conceptions of the public interest, different means to the realization of the public interest, but the debate has to include some conception of the public interest and its inclusivity. One of the issues is that in the American context, as I see it, that without totalizing parties, what you have now is a political process in which there is no governing concept of the public interest.
Yeah, so I think that actually goes back to the need for some kind of non-neutral consensus that is easy to erode. I think that is a real problem. So if you have fundamental disagreements about the public interest, that there's no common ground, then you're into the totalizing parties.
Yeah. Because that means you have to, and there has to be some attention to people who lose out. And, given that politics is about decisions, and decisions are not fully consensual, even if there's a backward consensus, there are losers, and losers have to be catered to. At least they have to believe that they've been heard.
Yeah.
And taken, that is part of what is sort of missing, I think, particularly, again, don't mean to criticize hosts, but that seems to be missing within American politics. But in my mind, the theory of the welfare state was partly a solution to that sort of issue. So when there were strong theories of the welfare state, and I remember as an undergraduate being taught by Bryce Galley a course called The Philosophy of the Welfare State, indicating the need for a clear theoretical concept of how the welfare state was a distinct form of a democracy and not something that was sort of accidental within it. And I'd say, well, the puzzle that you presented in the welfare state is it does address the issue of inequality. And it would be difficult, I think, to justify your argument that social democracy was tied to wealth in the context of one successful, partial perhaps, realization of social democracy is the most equal country, which
is?
well, Sweden.
Yeah, well, I think that's actually the perfect example, because Sweden is the most financialized and capitalistic of all countries.
Well, the problem is how you see it as capitalist. You could say, well, it's it manages what I might call a capitalism of production with a socialism of distribution.
Yeah, right.
So, in a sense, to say it's the most capitalist is paradoxical if it's formed, since our normal understanding of capitalism, say the presentation by Mushipus is that it creates superfluous people. One thing that Sweden doesn't produce is superfluous people.
Oh, yeah, it's got insanely high youth unemployment. So they actually, when I was there last year, I was talking to kids, and they were giving high school students jobs after they graduated, just to give them the experience of working, because it was unlikely they would get this experience any other way.
But it's a paradox to say it has high unemployment, and the solution to high unemployment was to give people jobs. What it primarily did was give people, what it does is give people income.
Yeah.
Given that most of what we've been discussing about the crisis that we confront is a crisis that maybe capitalism won't produce jobs, what you need is a capitalism that produces income and allows and enables it to be distributed. The closest that anywhere has come to that is social democracy.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Before radical social theory dispenses entirely with the idea of democracy, which I'm hearing here calling it social democracy or some other form of something which is not democracy, let me raise something which I think you and I talked about many years ago, but I've forgotten, so we'll do it again, which is the argument for democracy. It seems to me that any defender of democracy serious about the project would say that the evidence that we have accumulated so far is all evidence from something other than democracy.
Right.
And therefore, we just don't know what the possibilities are, and therefore we have to think as social theorists about what would be the conditions whereby democracy would be possible, and not welfare state democracy. Those are other issues, other things that are important. And one of the things it seems to me that would be the absolute next step would be to say that we've never raised a citizenry capable of
Right.
being Democrats.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the argument.
And that, as a result, the people that we're using to define who can handle democracy are people who were raised not to be able to
Right.
handle democracy.
Right.
And therefore, it's a closed circle.
Right.
And therefore, the next step would be to think about, starting in small scale, what would be the small institutions whereby people would build up the capacity, the gumption, the grit, the possibility, the workability, the negotiability, to be strong, good, and true Democrats. One just example. It seems to me that in our personal family relationships, in this complex age of the decline, of the dissolution of patriarchal and paternalistic families, in decline of marriage and all these other things, that what we are all experimenting about throughout the Western world, and I only speak about that, is the possibility of democratic, intimate relations in ways that have never happened before in world history, and that we're suffering the lumps from all that, all of us are, but at the same time we know that working together in a collaborative fashion is the way forward. We know that, we understand that, and when we're really good about it, we bring our children into it, and we say, you've got to be part of this too. So we are really talking about democracy from below.
Right.
That's democracy from below, and then I will talk with you in some future social theory conference in centuries to come. We will talk about actually existing democracies after we have enough evidence and growth of the democratic soul.
Yeah, no, I think you've turned MOVE on our head and said, no, you can't do it through the radicalizing the institutions, you gotta radicalize the people. I think that's, good luck, but, it's definitely a way of going, and, it's fine, and I think, I don't have any objection to that kind of democratic utopian theorizing, even if it's not utopian or not. My problem is with deriving it from, sort of an imminent account of genuine democracy.
None of these people are Democrats.
Well, that's right.
I mean, funny thing.
That's true.
All right, let's thank our speakers.